There you are again. Welcome to Planet America's Off the Planet with all of the extra bits, bonus stories and interviews that we didn't quite have time to get to on the air. I'm John Barron.
I'm Shazza Jadalo, and I promised that we would talk about January 6th. And in particular, let's start off with, are they going to get Trump or not? Legally, do you think they've made their case?
Well, look, I think Trump is doing his usual thing of, denying everything and trying to pivot the issue back to, but they were right to be upset because the election was being stolen from them. And whatever Trump maintains that he thinks the election was stolen, then in the sort of the logical framework that he's building, everything else is justified within that. It wasn't incitement. It was letting these, just allowing these people to express their anger. And that defence isn't really overcome by anything that we have heard in evidence. I don't think that Trump is being genuine when he says, well, why have you only subpoenaed me now? If you'd subpoenaed me ages ago, I could have come along. I'm not a little busy in November, kind of thing. So look, at the end of the day, it looks like a legal process. It is a political process. The question is whether it has made any difference politically and any difference in these midterms, and we just don't yet know.
Well, I'll pick up on the political in a second, but just on the legal side, all I'd say is we talked about in the show the Roger Stone. They've been focusing on Roger Stone, and I think that highlights the weakness of the legal side of their argument, which is that they have, I think, conclusively established that Trump always meant to march to the Capitol. The Secret Service didn't let him, but he meant to. They had an unsent tweet where he said, I'm going to march to the Capitol. So they demonstrated that. They also demonstrated that the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys intended to go to the Capitol to start a riot. Yeah. They went intending to create violence. I think they've demonstrated that. Yeah. Some people have pled guilty to that. But what they haven't demonstrated at all is a connection between Trump and those people. But they can demonstrate a connection between Stone and those people. So that's the reason I think they're concentrating on Roger Stone, because it's like a consolation prize. Yeah.
And we know that Stone and Trump were in frequent contact and remain so. And they've been in frequent contact since the 1980s. And so, it's certainly not out of the realms of possibility that even though this congressional inquiry can't find that missing link that we talked about in the show, that the FBI and the Justice Department and Merrick Garland, well, they would have a better chance of getting the kinds of phone records and the other things that would establish that case, potentially. So, in a sense, I do feel as though this hearing, it's probably its greatest function has been to sort of provide a little trail of breadcrumbs for the Department of Justice to go following and say, well, now a serious investigation can begin, not what is essentially a show trial. I mean, it's something that looks like a judicial process, but it's not.
There's certainly plenty of breadcrumbs to follow. There's no doubt about that. As far as the politics go, which you raised before, I think the polls are not encouraging in terms of the effect that the January 6th committee has had on people's views. It's still 41% of Americans, according to Monmouth, say that Trump should be charged for January 6th, which means that plenty of Joe Biden voters don't, let alone independents and Republicans. If you look at before and after, which a lot of people have been doing, tracking polls before and after the committee hearings, the biggest difference I've seen, I looked at all the tracking polls, the biggest one was from YouGov, where on average, in the 18 months before the committee started its work, an average of 66% of Republicans thought the 2020 election was rigged. After the January 6th committee held its first 8 hearings, an average of 60% of Republicans thought the 2020 election was rigged. So go down 6% after that. That's the biggest difference. Most of the polls have zero difference. So as you say, the proof will be in the pudding after the midterms, but I wouldn't say there's been a massive ground shift.
Some of the polling around should Donald Trump run again and would you like Donald Trump to be the Republican nominee in 2024? Some of that has drifted down, but really hard to say, is there any causation there? It could just be a product of the passage of time, people just slowly getting over Trump, want to turn a page to somebody new rather than anything that they've particularly seen in the January 6th hearing that may have soured them on Trump. And important as well, this is not something that gets covered live on Fox News. If it gets mentioned on Fox News, it is because this is a witch hunt, because this is a show trial, this is terrible Democrats, etc. You do get the sense that American minds are made up, and while there's been a lot of hate watching of viewers on MSNBC going, "What a bad guy, what a bad guy," it has that same sort of general sense of futility that the two impeachment trials had. This is a fixed thing. You got a prosecution without a defence, and you got no witness and no defendant. And what ultimately did it achieve? Probably very little.
What I would say, the one thing I would say I think it has achieved is that I think it's a good first draft of history. I think they've done a good job of collating a whole bunch of events which are hard to to get your head around because it's so complicated and so big.
Yep.
And they've snaffled it down to 1 hour blocks, which are very easy to watch, very, very short, sharp pieces. And I think they did a great job of that. So I think as far as doing some work for history, I think it's been very valuable, and I'm glad they did that. But I'm not sure from a political point of view it's made a huge difference, but we'll see.
Yeah, and similarly, we don't yet know what the spectacle of Donald Trump being compelled to testify, give a deposition in the week ahead in the defamation action brought by E. Jean Carroll, who he is accused of raping in the Bergdorf's department store in the 1990s. This started as a defamation case, but it looks to be evolving under this new New York law to also be able to involve the sexual assault allegation as well. They changed the law to allow historic attacks to be reconsidered. So whether, again, 2 or 3% of Republicans would think twice about a credibly accused rapist as their presidential nominee, Democrats were happy to ignore those sort of allegations against Bill Clinton for a very long time. So again, you do get the sense that partisanship will probably supersede any qualms about that.
Talking about which, let's go to the midterms quickly because we've got a very, very big interview to get to in a second. I talked about on the show that some of the underlying polls are quite positive for Republicans. In particular, competitive seats, they seem to do better at least in the House, than the generic vote. The generic vote doesn't matter; it's the competitive seats that matter. If you look at some of the other factors, like for instance, I haven't seen almost any polls where Democrats either tie them or beat them on enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is a key element of midterms because people don't turn out to vote and midterms don't care as much. And like for instance, in the Kaiser Foundation, 52% of Democrats are more motivated than usual to vote. 57% of Republicans are more motivated to vote. Usually there's a 4 or 5% gap on motivation and enthusiasm, which I think is a key stat. I feel like a couple of weeks ago, we were saying, Dobbs made a huge difference. The abortion ruling made a huge difference, and there are some extremely dubious candidates out there. But I feel like the race is starting to drift towards fundamentals again, where you expect the Democrats to get hosed a little bit in the midterms when inflation's high and the economy's not exactly singing. What are your thoughts?
Well, this election process effectively begins. Early voting starts in Georgia this week, one of the crucial states, not just in the Senate but the governor's race and so on. Enthusiasm is one of those. It's a little bit like the call to action you get in a TV commercial to go and buy a product. When you do have this extended voting period, it's like, okay, at what point when people say they're enthusiastic to vote, but enthusiastic to vote when? And they may talk about their enthusiasm, but actually making a plan, going to vote when you've got to register and all this kind of stuff. We'll just see how that translates. Typically, Republicans are more likely to vote in congressional midterm elections, and as a result, they sometimes outperform the polls. And we know that in recent years, the polls have been a little bit hazy, particularly when it comes to levels of Republican support. But on that, there's some very credible polls that are showing some potentially worrying signs for Republicans in 2 Senate seats that they hold and would have expected not to be that competitive. The first one in Ohio, where Congressman Tim Ryan, the Democrat, is challenging J.D. Vance, the novelist and anti-drugs campaigner who is seeking to replace the moderate Republican Rob Portman. Meanwhile, over in Iowa, 89-year-old Republican Senator Chuck Grassley, who's been in the Senate since the 1980s, is facing his stiffest contest in 40 years against Admiral Mike Franken, the Democrat, who is a Navy veteran and is within 3 points, 46-43 in the latest Seltzer poll in the Des Moines Register. That's one that Democrats have been trying hard with a centrist candidate to try and win back. He's a few troubles. Franken was accused of inappropriately kissing a former campaign staffer earlier in the year. So it hasn't been a trouble-free campaign. But he seems to be appealing to centrist Iowans, and Democrats are thinking that they might have a chance of taking that seat for the first time in a long time, winning back a Senate seat in Iowa for the first time since Tom Harkin resigned. So there are a few possible surprises there. And then on the Republican side, they are looking good in Nevada now with Adam Laxalt. So this is a very, very interesting picture, because without a Senate majority, Joe Biden doesn't get judicial appointments. A lot of things stop happening. Yeah,
I'd say there's three key parts of Nevada which aren't getting much coverage, which we should mention quickly. Number one, unlike most of the rest of America, abortion really isn't an issue in Nevada, because they had a constitutional vote in 1990 guaranteeing 24 weeks of abortion. So whatever happens, they're okay for abortion laws. So those attacks ring less effectively.
It becomes about the economy.
Yes, so it becomes more about the economy. Where, as I've said in previous episodes, gas prices are extremely high in Nevada. Also, they suffered more from lockdowns than almost any other state, Las Vegas being a tourism state, tourism city. So they are I think, unlike most other places, they're still angry about COVID. I think at least some people are, which I think will add to the
which is being
vote.
reflected in the Democrat governor, Joe Sisolak. It looks like he's in trouble as well. And that, you're right, could have something to do with that.
And thirdly, unions are always a huge issue in Nevada, because the unions are very powerful in the casinos, and Harry Reid got it down to a fine art, getting the union vote out.
The Reid political machine.
Election after election. Unfortunately, Harry Reid is dead, and so is his political machine. And this is the first election where we're seeing them without the Harry Reid political machine. And I suspect that might cost them 1 or 2% in turnout. So you put them together, and it's a 50-50 contest. I reckon that is actually leaning probably to the Republicans, I would say.
All right. Now, we're going to turn our attention to foreign policy. We've got a great guest to hear from, but a quick program note on that before we do.
Yes. We actually recorded this halfway through last week, and one of the questions that we ask is about a bit of a quid pro quo with Saudi Arabia, which I just picked out of one paragraph in the New York Times, which was nothing at the time, and Richard Fontaine, the guy we spoke to, made a big deal out of nothing's been proven, we have no idea, this may not be true. Obviously, since then, a lot of news has broken on that exact topic. So yes, Richard Fontaine does read the news, he's aware of that, but this was recorded before all that extra information came out, just so you know.
Time now on Planet America to talk about all the trouble in the world. Our guest in the fake Oval Office is Richard Fontaine. We had him on the show about 6 years ago. These days, he is the CEO of the Centre for New American Security. He is also a former foreign policy advisor to the late Senator John McCain. Richard Fontaine, welcome back to Planet America.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Where should we start? I guess the big news in Washington at the moment is the review of US-Saudi relations following the decision last week by the OPEC Plus oil cartel nations to cut supply, potentially increasing the price at the petrol pump for Americans in the weeks leading up to a midterm election. Provocative. In return, the Biden administration is saying we're reviewing the relationship. In reality, how far do you think that review is likely to go, and where could it end up?
The problem in that relationship is Saudi Arabia has something the Americans want. The administration came in, said we're going to punish the Saudis, we'll make them a pariah for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, things like that. That lasted for a while. Price of oil went up more, had political effects in the United States, and suddenly the Saudis got the supply of oil. The president went over there, fist bumped, Mohammed bin Salman and so forth. And now they've decided to push the price up rather than down. That was not the plan. So you can review the policy. They'll probably take some symbolic steps, but the Saudis are still going to have things that the United States wants, and so you're not going to be able to sever that relationship.
Of course, America has something that Saudi Arabia wants as well, which is military hardware.
Exactly.
Now, I've read articles which suggest that while people fear that Saudi Arabia could just go to Russia if America nicked off, they really can't, because their entire infrastructure at the moment is built by Americans, and they can't just import a Russian piece of equipment in the middle of this infrastructure. So they're kind of stuffed if they don't have American military backup. Is that true or not?
Generally speaking, yes. They have some Chinese hardware here and there, but they can't just turn on a dime and say, okay, the Americans won't sell us stuff, and so we're going to go start to buy other things and train our people on it and so forth. So the arms sale relationship has been a huge part of the Saudi-American relationship for a long period of time, and it is a point of potential leverage for the United States. But again, you have to try to determine, what are you going to use that for? What are you going to try to get for that if you turn that on or off or moderate it or condition it? And I think that probably will be part of this review, because at the end of the day, the United States wants several things out of Saudi Arabia. Well, one of them is to be the swing producer of oil. So when the price goes up, they're supposed to bring in more supply and go down rather than the other way around.
One of the measures that is being discussed in Washington at the moment is the idea that the exemption for the cartel behaviour of OPEC Plus could be removed, that antitrust suits could be brought as a result. Is that just the kind of thing you say when you're threatening people? You want them to actually just go, okay, have another million barrels, or is it a realistic option?
It's the kind of thing you say when you want people to produce another million barrels. And it's also not the first time that this has been bandied about. I mean, every few years when there's some spike in the price of oil and therefore gasoline in the United States, and there's sort of the anger and fish shaking at OPEC, then someone says, well, this is sort of like Major League Baseball. It's a cartel. It's a monopoly. We should be trust busters and try to break this thing up. It never has happened before. There's actually, some value in having a cartel, so to speak, avoid the boom-bust cycles that would otherwise be the case if you had a completely free market on oil production. And of course, right now, the United States is leading a buyer's cartel that is trying to reduce the value that Russia gets for its oil on the international market. So I don't expect to see, the forcible breakup of OPEC through U.S. law.
A couple of things I don't understand, which hopefully you can clarify for me. I've read rumours that America is talking about lifting sanctions on Venezuela to try and get Venezuela to pump more oil to fill in the breach. But Venezuela is also part of OPEC Plus. So aren't they restricted by the same cartel?
They are. You could see if they would defect, which they could. And the other thing is, there's additional problems beyond the sanctions. So the decrepit state of Venezuela oil production facilities and industry is such that, even if the sanctions came off and even if OPEC said pump as much as you want, the Venezuelans are going to have real difficulty going up very much. I mean, they're still way below the levels that you would normally expect Venezuela to be at. There's been very little investment, very little maintenance of their oil production facilities. So there's been talk since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine about some sort of deal with Venezuela to bring them out of the cold and lift sanctions. They put more oil on the market. I just think it's very realistic, either as a diplomatic foreign policy matter or just as a supply matter. I mean, they could do a little bit, but that's not going to be the answer here.
It's getting colder in Europe, and a lot of people are concerned that as the conflict in Ukraine drags on and the various embargoes, sanctions, and just the switching off of some oil and gas pipelines continues, that there's going to be potentially a new kind of warfare this winter involving civilians freezing to death in their apartments. How bad could that get, do you think?
It could get quite bad. I mean, there's been this worry that as the winter sets in, Europeans will defect from the sanctions on Russia and gas sanctions and so forth. These sanctions are now in EU law. So Viktor Orban in Hungary would like to undo that. It's not easily done unless they now revise EU law, which they don't look like they're going to do. So it looks like these things are going to continue on. And of course, Putin has a strong interest in exacerbating the fears and anxieties of the Europeans. And that's why you saw, for example, this attack on the Nord Stream 1 pipeline that goes under the sea. There's other pipelines that go under the sea. So the combination of being a supplier and being a violent disruptor means that, the Russians have some ability to control the amount of gas and therefore the amount of heat that's in Europe. So, that's why I'm in Australia. It's in the Southern Hemisphere.
I want to read you a quote from the New York Times, then ask you about it. The quote is, it's talking about the American government here. They had an understanding with Saudi Arabia. This is talking about the meeting back in July.
Yep.
They had an understanding with Saudi Arabia that it would increase oil production in the fall and thus lower gasoline prices heading into the crucial congressional elections. Now, trying to pressure a client country through foreign policy to assist re-election, isn't that exactly what Trump was impeached for the first time?
I don't know that that's accurate, but so, I'd be interested in whether it's accurate before we start comparing it to impeachable offenses conducted by the previous president. Nevertheless, you know, and the timing and all this other stuff. But I think generally speaking, when the president went to Saudi Arabia, the idea was to get more oil production on the global market because the price had gone so high. So I think that's entirely in the American interest. Now, if you're trying to time that to the election, first of all, I don't know if that's true, but you know, that would seem to be a rather tricky maneuver to try to time out, both as a foreign policy matter, but also as a political matter. I mean, when is the right time for people's prices to go down, right? I don't know. So,
Richard, there's been a bit of talk in recent times in Washington about finding an off-ramp for the Russians in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have consistently said, well, the off-ramp is back on your side of the border as it was, and get out of Crimea while you're at it. Is there any flex in that? Do you think is the United States brokering any ideas of compromise?
So far, well, I shouldn't say so far. At the moment, there are no real negotiations or articulations of positions that are going back and forth. There was at the very beginning of the war, and frankly, the Ukrainians would have agreed to things in February or maybe even March that they will not agree to now. One, because they're winning, but two, because of the horrible atrocities that they've suffered in places like Bucha and these other things that have quite rightly radicalized the Ukrainian people and said, you know, we're going to make a deal with these guys who are killing civilians everywhere and everything else. So there's nothing really going on diplomatically right now. I think the first potential off-ramp is if you saw a return to the February 24th status quo ante. So even if there were Russian partisans that had a foothold in Donbass and Luhansk and Donetsk and then in Crimea, it's not completely clear, at least to me, that the Ukrainians wouldn't pause and decide what to do before trying to further liberate the rest of the territories, which are theirs, as opposed to negotiating and not accepting politically and diplomatically Russia's possession of those. But right now, it's just a big question mark. I mean, both sides clearly discern a much greater interest in fighting on than talking and trying to find some sort of diplomatic resolution.
Do you really think there's any realistic chance that Vladimir Putin would actually use a nuclear weapon, given that, the way I see it, there are two different options. One, he can attack civilian targets, which in Ukraine, which that would be pretty extreme. Or he could use a tactical nuke in a military capacity, in which case he'd be blowing up Russian-claimed territory at the moment and potentially Russian soldiers at the same time. Do you think it's realistic in either case?
I think it's realistic. I think the probability is low, but it's a hell of a lot higher than we should be comfortable with, and it's higher than it used to be, and the chances of a nuclear use are probably higher than they've been since 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That said, I think they're low for the reasons that you said, the battlefield utility of these things. I mean, the Russians would then have to conduct warfare in a nuclear environment. Their troops can't conduct effective warfare in a non-nuclear environment, and you know, the kind of conditions on the ground are not very conducive to an effective use of this stuff. Two, I mean, if you're looking for the one thing to elicit even more of the world coming at you, that would be it. So, and not knowing what that's something that the world would do to you, including the United States, whether it includes military or more sanctions from countries that have stood by, who knows. So I think all of those are reasons why he shouldn't, and I think there are reasons why he won't. But I say I think because I also couldn't figure out what he would do when he got to Kiev, because, you know, Americans know something about what it's like to occupy a country. Doesn't want to be occupied by you. You get an insurgency. You got to try to hold that territory. You need many more troops than you think you do in the beginning. And all those were reasons not to do it. And he did it anyway. So, you know, just the logic and facts and evidence associated with this militates toward him not doing it, but that doesn't mean he won't.
More than once in history, Russian or Soviet forces have used a scorched earth policy in retreat. I guess the ultimate way of scorching the earth at the moment is whether it's with tactical nuclear weapons or just blowing up a nuclear reactor or a power station. How great is the danger if the Russians are continue to be forced back east from Ukraine, that we could see some catastrophic event along the lines of you know, a Chernobyl, but deliberately started? Well,
they have already deliberately attacked civilian nuclear facilities in Ukraine, so the chances of that are high. They've done it already, and you know, the possible dispersal of radioactive material all over the place did not seem to be a deterrent, but rather something that made it an attractive kind of target to say, look, this is what you guys are going to get if you keep this up, and we're willing to go this far. Obviously, the use of a nuclear weapon is something we haven't seen since 1945. I mean, the world would be a very different place if we woke up the day after, Putin's used even a tactical nuclear weapon. So I think the bar to that is significantly higher, but as we were just saying, I don't think it's infinitely high.
Do we have any concerns about Zelensky? Because, at the moment, he's being portrayed in the West as this freedom fighter, but directly before the war, he used the legal system against his opponents. He's closed down newspapers and TV channels. It's not like he's a great liberal himself.
Yeah, I mean, I think Zelensky is one of these classic cases where, greatness is made by circumstances, right? And before he was a Paul, and, then he became a Churchillian sort of wartime leader with an unbelievable amount of moral and physical courage and an ability to inspire the world through Zoom calls into every legislature and everything else. And I think that's very real. But he's also a political leader. And I think that cuts in multiple ways, including if you do get to this sort of negotiation stage, who's going to be able to have the political backing, Zelensky or Zelensky plus others, to be able to reach some sort of ceasefire with the Russians? That's a political matter that he's going to have to think through. And even very, very popular Zelensky can't believe that he has the support to do just anything he wants in terms of an agreement. So I think that sort of political side is going to come back to the fore, not just in the sort of domestic side that you were talking about, but also with Russia.
One of the other big potential flashpoints in American foreign policy this year has been increasing tensions with China, particularly over Taiwan. What have you made of President Biden's first couple of times he said it, we thought it was Joe Biden being gaffe-prone Joe Biden, but it seems as though he's sending a very firm message now to China that actually, within strategic ambiguity, you can be damn certain we're going to defend Taiwan.
Yeah, the Washington gaffe is defined as when you mess up and accidentally say what you believe. And I think 4 times now the president has said, if China attacks Taiwan, we will defend Taiwan. There doesn't seem to be any reason to doubt that that's what he believes and what he would do. Of course, circumstances would matter. And of course, the administration then scrambles to say, no, policy hasn't changed. We will defend and we may defend, or the same thing, right? But who's the decider? The commander in chief. Now, I mean, if we, God forbid, got to that point, then presumably he would need Congress on his side with an authorization and so forth. But I bet he would get it. And so if you're the Chinese or anybody else, I would take his word of what he would do as the clearest demonstration of intent, rather than these kind of elliptical formulations of policy that try to account for greater ambiguity.
Do you think it's acceptable for administration officials to keep on contradicting the president like that? Like the first time, he might have made a mistake. By the 4th time, he's pretty clearly saying what he thinks, and they're still turning up after him and saying, no, what the president says is wrong. Our policy continues on. I mean, is that acceptable? Is that anti-democratic?
I guess it's acceptable in the sense that on the 4th time, it was Biden himself that came out the next day and said the policy hadn't changed. So what are you going to do? I mean,
sure. Do you think that the way that the conflict in Ukraine has unfolded has made a Chinese move on Taiwan more or less likely?
It's hard to say, but I suspect it's put more time on the clock rather than taking time off the clock in terms of the Chinese potential move on Taiwan, for a couple of reasons. One, I think everybody's trying to learn something from what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. One, as a battlefield matter, they want to, it turns out that getting to the place that you'd like to invade is not even half the battle. Then you got to figure out what you do when you get there. You could have an insurgency on your hands. Are the Taiwanese like the Ukrainians or not? That's an open question in terms of this kind of thing. And then the other is the global reaction. And so I could see, for example, the Chinese watching to see, there's very severe sanctions on Russia. There's export controls, all of this. Well, do we fast forward 2 years or 3 years? And it's kind of like Crimea, kind of like Hong Kong. Cooler heads prevail. People get tired of the sanctions. They don't think the stuff that they sanction is reversible anyway. And suddenly, who's got Crimea and who's got Hong Kong? Or is this categorically different and suggestive of what might happen to China if it invaded Taiwan? I think those are big question marks, and the Chinese are learning, as is everyone else. And so I suspect that they are trying to take some time to internalize that.
How much are the tensions with Taiwan about silicon chip manufacturing, which they are the world leader in?
Well, some of it clearly is, I mean, the US economy, as so many other economies, is now dependent on high-end semiconductors, and the majority of those semiconductors are made at TSMC in Taiwan. And so if, again, God forbid, China were to take over the island and restrict the export of high-end semiconductors to the U.S. economy, we'd be in a world of hurt. I mean, you know, we've always thought through what are the effects of an oil shock on our economy, and we've been prepared to do pretty extraordinary things to try to avoid one, going to Saudi Arabia and, you know, things like that. But this would be a semiconductor shock. This is, we haven't really priced in before, but arguably it's even more consequential in terms of economic impact. So that's clearly one of the things. But of course, the affection for Taiwan and for Taiwanese democracy predates the semiconductor set of issues, and, you know, the U.S. desire to be partnering to some degree with Taiwan. It goes back decades and decades. So that's still there too, of course.
Let's keep bouncing around the world. Iran, we've seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks some very significant human rights protests led by Iranian women, targeting the strictures of the so-called morality police. About 200 people have died so far in the crackdown against this. Where do you see that going, and what, if any, role, given America's fraught relationship with Iran, or lack of a relationship with Iran, do you see the United States as playing there?
Yeah, I, of course, like so many others, hope that these protests can take flight and continue and result in some sort of change. I think this is the most profound domestic challenge to the Islamic Republic since 1979. That said, they have perfected since 1979 their repressive techniques and their ability to crack down on protests, and they're not afraid to spill blood and everything else. There are things we've never seen before. Oil workers going on strike in solidarity with the women protesting. But, you know, unfortunately, I guess if I had to bet, I would bet that repression ultimately wins out, just because the Iranians have been so effective at it before. But I would hope otherwise. The U.S. role is basically one of moral support, showing that the people of Iran are heard around the world, and including in the United States, that we generally support their claims and their point of view and their grievances against the government, and don't support the way the government either treats its own people or acts internationally. But beyond that, and, you know, there's some sanctions and things like that, but Iran's already a very sanctioned country, so there's some serious limits.
Obviously, in the background with Iran, there's this attempt to reconstruct the nuclear deal.
Yeah.
The proponents of the nuclear deal would say that's the only way, literally the only way, you'll stop Iran getting a nuclear bomb at some point in time in the near future. Whereas the opponents say, even with a deal, they're just going to cheat anyway. They always cheat. So what's the point? You're just giving them money that they will then use to cheat with. What's your view?
Well, I think the protests in Iran make it so that the re-entry into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, is probably not an imminent thing. There were problems in terms of coming back to it anyway, just in terms of the negotiations. But I think the broader context of this has made this unlikely for the near future. It's a tough one because the Iran nuclear deal would buy a few years, not very many years, but a few years in terms of capping Iranian uranium production and enrichment in Iran. And then you're back to the problem that you had originally. But if you don't have the deal, then you have the problem now, which is the situation we have now. So it's hard to say. I think that there are terms under which, if we could get the Iranians to agree to them, it would be worth reviving the deal, but not at the price that the Iranians are trying to extract, which is, you know, an end to investigations of their clandestine nuclear activities, and they've put other non-nuclear things on the table.
Joe Biden's Democrats look highly likely to lose their House majority this November. Traditionally, when first-term presidents lose their ability to legislate, they pivot very hard to foreign policy. And if you're an 80-year-old president like Joe Biden, all those years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, 36 years in the Senate, he must have a to-do list. If he ever got to the Resolute desk, things that he would like to get done in this world while he can. Do you have any sense as to what that might be right now?
No, but I will tell you what many people hope that it will be, which is a trade agenda. Because, of course, during the Trump administration, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, putting sanctions on all kinds of countries and things, and then Joe Biden came in, inherited all those, kept the sanctions in place, has also not re-entered TPP or sealed any bilateral trade deals. In a place like the Indo-Pacific in particular, trade policy is foreign policy. It really matters. It signals engagement and so forth. The domestic politics of trade are really tough in the United States right now. But post-midterm election, when you'll have at least one house in the Republican hands, the Republicans are not as pro-free trade as they used to be, but they're still more pro-free trade than the Democrats. That's probably the best opportunity that politically a trade agenda will have for a number of years. And so that opportunity will be there if the president chooses to take it. Whether he will, I don't know, you can tell me.
Do you genuinely think that there's a realistic prospect of enough Republican senators signing on to a trade deal negotiated by Joe Biden that they could get through the Senate?
Yeah, because I think that had Barack Obama not left basically to the final weeks of an 8-year presidency trying to get approval of TPP, he could have done it. And a year before the non-approval of TPP, the Republican Congress voted to give Obama trade promotion authority, which is the ability to negotiate these things without Congress meddling with it. And that was a congressional-led effort. So, yes, I think it's possible.
Critics of President Biden, those who still support Donald Trump, tend to say Biden's been a terrible president. His foreign policy was summed up by Afghanis falling to their death from a transport plane as it left Kabul last year. And that sums up Joe Biden's foreign policy. And that Putin would not have invaded Ukraine if Donald Trump had been president still. China wouldn't dare to threaten to invade Taiwan if Donald Trump was there. Is any of that, in your view, true? And what would be your report card for President Biden's 2 years in office so far?
It's been very mixed. Afghanistan was obviously a cataclysm on many fronts, and a humanitarian disaster and everything else, and the end of a 20-year war in which so much blood and treasure was spent to go down and defeat the way it did was pretty bad. On the other hand, the administration, I think, has done a fairly masterful job at putting together what I would call the anti-aggression coalition to support Ukraine and to punish and restrict the activities of Russia, which was no automatic thing. I mean, American leadership has been critical in this effort. And then, you know, some of the efforts that they've done on taking opportunities, AUKUS, the Quad, you know, some of the things out in the Indo-Pacific have been pretty meaningful too. So I think it's been a mixed bag with, you know, Afghanistan being the absolutely low point and probably the response to Russia-Ukraine being at the high point. You know, I hear these claims too that, you know, if only Trump was president, things would be much better now because, you know, people in the world wouldn't dare to, you know, threaten the United States. Who the hell knows? You can't prove anything, but Trump was president when Kim Jong-un was threatening to attack Guam and Hawaii with nuclear weapons, which led President Trump to go to the UN and say that he would wipe North Korea off the face of the earth. So it's, you know, it's not the mere existence of President Trump made everyone shy away from any sort of threatening behavior.
We got to wrap. You got one more?
Yeah, I got one more. Let's deal with the one part of the world we haven't talked about so far. Just, leaving aside the intricacies of border policy, there are lots and lots and lots of asylum seekers coming out of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela that weren't there until this year, essentially. Looking at the geopolitics of those three countries, regardless of America's policies on the border, can we expect more, the same, or fewer asylum seekers from those countries in the next few years, do you think?
Probably more. I mean, there's not much reason to think that things are going to turn around. If you look at what's pushing these asylum seekers out of their countries, terrible governance, poor economy, you know, in some places crime and fear for their families. I mean, do you think Cuba's going to turn around on any of those matters in the next couple of years? How about Nicaragua? I mean, so I think the answer is probably no. I think we're going to see this continue to increase.
Okay.
Richard Fontaine, great to see you again. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're just about out of time for Off the Planet, but one more thing, Chaz.
Yes. I just want to add in, because we talked in the show about Herschel Walker and the Georgia debate, and I just wondered...
Not nearly as bad as we expected.
Yeah, I got to say, like, debates are judged by how you go compared to what people expect, generally speaking. And people expected Herschel Walker's lip to be on the ground and for him to make a complete mess of himself. And there were ridiculous moments. At one point in time, he took out a fake police badge.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know why he did that. But generally, he was a lot better than I expected. And I think a lot of people expected. So that actually probably would have helped him a lot. Like he was almost entirely coherent throughout it. I know it's a low standard, but people did not expect that.
Yep.
And he actually got off some good shots.
Yep.
There was a bit where Warnock was talking about abortion, and he was painting Herschel Walker as an extremist, as you would expect, because Herschel Walker does have quite extreme views. And Warnock was saying, look, my view is that a doctor's room is not big enough for the government, the mother, and the doctor to fit in all together. So get the government out of there. It should just be the mother and the doctor. He said 2 or 3 times. That was his little talking point, right? Yep. And then Herschel Walker, right off the cuff, said, I'd just like to remind you there's also a baby in that room as well. And which was a good shot. And he delivered it better than I just did.
I don't think you're right, though, when you say it was off the cuff. That, to me, felt like a "you're no Jack Kennedy" kind of a moment. It was Warnock has used that talking point.
That's true.
And this was the zinger to get him back. But
That's a fair call. He did nail it. And the Conservatives sent that around all over the place. Oh, look at this, look at this. And that's the way the media works. You take that one moment from a debate, that one 30-second moment, and that's the whole debate.
Yeah.
So I think he actually did pretty well out of that. And also, Warnock, I thought, made a bit of a mess out of another issue, which we haven't mentioned at all, which was an issue about his church evicting poor people for not paying rent. In particular, there was one lawsuit where they started to evict a person for owing $28 in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, right after Warnock had a go at renters. And so now Warnock is not the person who's evicting them. They're accusing him by association with the church that he runs. But having said that, he dealt with it quite poorly in the debate. So I actually think that debate helped Walker quite a lot.
And in a case probably of quitting while you're ahead, Herschel Walker did not turn up for today's second debate with Raphael Warnock. There was an empty podium there. And meanwhile, in the days ahead, we have the one-off debate between Dr. Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania and his Democrat rival, John Fetterman, who, of course, survived a stroke back in May of this year. And John Fetterman, who's still got some lingering, it seems, aphasia because of that, difficulty in speaking at times. And he's going to be assisted. Yes.
He just did an interview just a couple of days ago where, because he doesn't have trouble understanding stuff, he just has trouble, as you say, when he hears something, he has trouble processing what he hears. But he can read fine. And so when he did this interview, he had this massive computer in front of him. And as they asked him questions, he was reading the questions. The text came up as they were being asked, and he would then respond. And he was completely fluent. There were no problems. He's going to have that technology at the debate as well. So he will be reading what people are saying rather than hearing what they're saying. And that computer's going to be right in front of him. So people are going to be very aware of it.
But given that there have been months and months of ads that have been questioning whether he is up to debating and whether he's up to serving as senator if he were to be elected, it's a huge amount riding on this. He's only got a 5 or 6 point buffer in the polls.
There really is a huge riding on it because he hasn't released his medical records. He's released a letter from his doctor saying, from way back when, from like June.
It's a pity Trump's doctor died.
A great letter. The letter from the doctor back in June said he'll be fit to serve in the Senate if he continues his rehab, but he's released no other official records at all. And he keeps on saying, I don't need to because you can see the proof when I get up there and debate. Yep. So he himself is building up the debate as massive. So it's going to be very big for this race, I feel.
Yeah, high wire act indeed. Well, things are getting pretty willing, Chaz, into the final stretch. 3 and a bit weeks to go. We'll see you for Planet America at 9:35 p.m. on ABC TV, right after Media Watch, and Off the Planet on iView and online whenever it suits you. Bye-bye.